Crisis in the Atlantic. In the early years of the Second World War, the fate of the British Isles hung in the balance on the high seas. With continental Europe under German control and the United Kingdom standing alone, the lifeline connecting Britain to the world became the merchant convoys crossing the Atlantic. The sea lanes were the source of food, raw materials, munitions, fuel and everything the island nation needed to survive and fight. As the Battle of the Atlantic unfolded from 1939 onwards, Britain confronted an existential threat. The German U-boat war meant that every ship sailing to or from British ports was prey to the lurking submarines of the Kriegsmarine. By 1940 the danger had become acute. Months when some 300 merchant ships were being sunk became routine. Without a steady flow of supplies, Britain's war economy could have collapsed, and the courage of her people would have been tested in very different circumstances. The conventional approach to protecting those convoys was to deploy destroyers, fast, heavily armed warships able to chase submarines, defend the convoys and impose sea control. But the reality was grim. The British surface fleet could not build or allocate enough destroyers fast enough. They cost perhaps on the order of £900,000 each, in 1940s terms, and required specialized shipyards and long lead times. Into this void stepped a radically different solution, a vessel of modest size, inexpensive to build, based on commercial ship designs, yet capable of fulfilling the essential mission, to keep the convoys going, to deny the submarines free rein, and thereby to buy Britain time. That vessel was the humble corvette, particularly the class known to history as the Flower-class corvette. The Flower-class were born not from high naval doctrine but from blunt industrial necessity. Designed when prudence met urgency, they were built in great numbers, launched from civilian shipyards, and deployed to the Atlantic battle when older designs would have taken too long. Their mission was not glamorous, they were slow, cramped, uncomfortable, but what they lacked in elegance they more than made up for in quantity and dogged service. In the vast battle of ships and men, they proved that sometimes the cheaper, simpler solution wins, not by outclassing the enemy in every engagement, but by outlasting them, outproducing them, and denying them the strategy they hoped to use. In the pages of naval history we often read of technical marvels and high-end weapons. Yet the story of the Flower class is more humble. How Britain's merchant ship lifeline was kept open, how the U-boat threat was gradually blunted, and how the war at sea shifted not because of a single superior machine, but because a nation chose resilience and mass production over perfection. The birth of the Flower class, design and industrial strategy. When the decision was taken to build many small escort vessels, the design team turned to the simplest effective solution, a ship that could be built cheaply, completed quickly, and operated by a partly reserve crew. The Flower-class corvette drew directly from commercial whaler and fishing boat designs, hull forms that civilian shipyards were familiar with, rather than highly specialized warship designs. Notably, the design by Smith's Dock Company in South Bank-on-Tees used a whaler blueprint as the baseline. Cost-wise, the corvettes were astonishing bargains. Some sources cite a cost around £90,000 each, in wartime British pounds, a fraction of the cost for a destroyer. Because the design was based on a civilian hull, many smaller shipyards that were not heavily engaged in major warship construction could contribute. The result? Hundreds of escort vessels could be churned out rapidly. Performance-wise they were modest. The design speed was about 16 knots, approximately equals 30 kilometers per hour, well below the 30 knots or more of a fleet destroyer. Armament was light, typically a single 4-inch gun forward, a basic anti-aircraft mount aft, depth charges, an ASDIC early sonar, plus by mid-war HFDF high-frequency direction finding sets. The hull was short, around 200 to 230 feet, and had shallow draft, enabling many shipyards to build them. These ships were never designed to engage enemy surface combatants or fight in fleet actions. Their mission was escort, to stay with the convoy, detect submarines, force them to dive, and keep the sea lanes open. A key advantage: they could be built in far greater numbers than the limited number of destroyer output allowed. Indeed, the Flower class eventually made up half of all Allied convoy escorts in the North Atlantic. This abundance of escort vessels changed the game. The German submarine fleet relied on being able to find convoys unprotected or lightly defended. With a growing screen of corvettes and other escorts, the U-boats found themselves increasingly challenged. The industrial strategy here is clear. Britain accepted that it could not build enough high-end warships fast enough, so it shifted to mass-produced, adequate vessels. Quality was moderate, comfort non-existent, but the mission got done. The economic calculation is essential. Each corvette saved many times its cost by preserving merchant tonnage, by preventing sinkings, by keeping the flow of supplies going. Perhaps more importantly, the resources freed by avoiding a total shipping collapse allowed Britain to fund other operations, building aircraft, tanks, fighters, and eventually supporting the D-Day landings in 1944. The Corvette program stands as a textbook example of quantity influencing quality of outcome: cheap ship, large numbers, relentless deployment. Furthermore, the conversion of civilian shipyard capacity to war production meant that the British industrial base was fully mobilized. Smaller yards which might have built fishing vessels or coasters pre-war were now building warships. The ripple effect: employment, training, regional ship-building revival, and sheer momentum in a time of crisis. The story of the Flower class is not only one of ships and sea fights, it is a story of national industrial mobilization. The battle, tactics and the turning of the tide. Once deployed, the Flower class corvettes entered the thick of the fight in the mid-Atlantic, often in the so-called Black Pit, the gap in air cover between Newfoundland and the British Isles, where convoys were especially vulnerable. The convoys sailed these dangerous waters knowing that at any moment the sea floor darkness might conceal a prowling U-boat. The task of an escort was brutal: long hours, perpetual watch, cold, wet, seasick crews, and the constant possibility of attack. Tactically, the doctrine was evolving. A surfaced U-boat attacking at night might overwhelm a convoy before the escorts reacted. The corvette's role: detect the submarine via ASDIC if submerged, radar, huff duff later, force it to dive, drop depth charges, keep it busy, and thereby protect the merchant ships from loss. In wolf pack attacks, the enemy attempted to surround a convoy and send multiple U-boats in waves. But the presence of many small escorts meant the wolf pack's advantage of surprise and numbers was eroded. The German plan under Karl Dönitz relied on high-quality submarines, superior tactics, and overwhelming attack waves. But the British response: mass-produced escorts, improved detection and weapons, better convoy tactics, gradually turned the tables. The U-boat could no longer guarantee free reign of the Atlantic, the flow of supplies to Britain kept going. Losses still occurred, but the worst of the crisis passed. In March 1941, for example, the corvette HMS Gladiolus K-34, built by Smith's Dock, entered service and over her 18 months escorted over 40 convoys, participated in 4 major battles and helped destroy 3 U-boats before she herself was lost in October 1941. That illustrates both the value and danger of the job. The disadvantage of the Flower class was real. Slow speed meant that if a U-boat attacked a convoy at full speed and escaped, the escort could not always catch it. The sea state structure of the North Atlantic meant the corvettes rolled heavily in heavy weather. 40-degree tilts side to side were common. Crews often suffered seasickness, sleep deprivation, and mechanical strain. But these shortcomings did not prevent success. The addition of better sensors, radar, HFDF, forward-throwing weapons, improved tactics and the sheer weight of numbers shifted the balance. By May 1943, the critical phase of the Battle of the Atlantic had passed for the U-boats. After this point the Allies gained clear supremacy. The presence of many corvettes, escort carriers, long-range aircraft and enough destroyers meant the U-boats were hunted as much as hunters. The convoy system, once vulnerable, became resilient. Britain's sea lifeline held. One of the most telling metrics is not merely U-boats destroyed but tonnage saved and convoys completed intact, for the Flower class were never meant to be glamorous submarine killers, but reliable escort workhorses. As the Canadian Navy historian emphasizes, the corvette was the workhorse of the Battle of the Atlantic, quick and inexpensive to build. Their value lay in preserving the ship-to-ship logistics of war. Life aboard, legacy and strategic impact. What was life like aboard one of these cheap escorts? Many sailors describe the Flower class as rolling like wet grass in heavy seas, with severe motion sickness, endless spray, damp decks, crowded sleeping quarters and limited comfort. The forecastle dipped into waves, water cascaded into the well deck, and condensation dripped from overheads. Food was basic, much of it preserved. Corned beef and powdered potatoes dominated. The crews were often reservists, or drawn from the merchant navy, the officers likewise. The ships were cramped, Crew numbers rose beyond what the original civilian design intended, meaning bunks on lockers or even tabletops. Yet despite these hardships, the crews built a culture of perseverance, of duty and endurance. Many surviving veterans recall the ship's company as tight-knit, resilient and committed to the mission. The legacy of the Flower-class corvettes remains significant. Their mass production model foreshadowed modern naval thinking about good enough platforms built in numbers rather than a handful of expensive high-end machines. As one recent article notes, the Royal Navy today draws lessons from those corvettes for its uncrewed escort programs: simple hull, mass production, greater numbers. Strategically, the decision to invest in many escorts rather than fewer elite warships paid off. Commodities kept moving, food and fuel reached Britain, and the war machine of the Empire and Allies remained supplied. Furthermore, the resources saved by the corvette program contributed indirectly to other vital operations, from the build-up to D-Day to the strategic bombing campaign to support for the Soviet northern convoys. By keeping the sea lanes open and merchant tonnage moving, Britain stayed in the fight when defeat may have otherwise loomed. The scoreboard of submarine kills is often mis-emphasized. While the Flower class are credited with the sinking of some German submarines, 47 German and 4 Italian according to one source, their true victory was in prevention, preventing sinkings, preserving convoys, denying U-boat freedom. The fact that critics at the time called them unseaworthy rubbish only makes their achievement more remarkable. They were cheap, slow, uncomfortable, but they answered the call. Today, the last surviving Flower-class corvette in Canada is preserved as a museum ship, reminding us of the men who sailed in those tiny escorts. As we look back, we can appreciate that in the long struggle of the Atlantic the smallest of ships made the biggest difference. Rivets, reciprocating steam engines, mass ship-building yards, working-class labor, and sheer bloody-minded persistence preserved Britain's sea lifeline. In concluding, this documentary reveals how Britain won the Battle of the Atlantic not by having the finest fleet of destroyers, but by turning to humble fishing boat-derived warships built in large numbers, how the U-boat wolf packs were blunted not only by technology, but by industrial scale, how a sailor in a corvette endured 40-degree rolls, seasickness, endless watches, and freezing seas, how the little ships changed the economic calculations of warfare, and how working-class shipyards on the Tees, Clyde, and across Canada built the vessels that kept Britain in the war and helped bring victory. Final words. In the epic story of the Second World War, the sea lanes of the Atlantic were a battlefield as critical as Normandy or Stalingrad. The seemingly mundane decision to build inexpensive escort ships derived from commercial designs turned out to be a strategic masterstroke. The Flower-class corvettes were not glamorous, they were not fast, they did not have heavy armor. But they answered the question of survival: how to keep the convoys moving in the face of a wolf-pack submarine threat, how to build enough ships fast enough, and how to mobilize industry, shipyards and manpower to meet the crisis. They proved that in war sometimes the best weapon is not the supreme technology but the right quantity, built quickly, and deployed relentlessly. The price of liberty was paid by men in small ships rolling on the Atlantic, often unseen and unsung, but their service changed the course of history.